The Grand Majestic Theatre stood bathed in gold, its lights flickering like a promise. For Otis Langston, it was more than a building. It was memory, legacy, and tonight a reckoning. Dressed sharp and hopeful, Otis had come for one reason: to witness a story that mirrored his own. But when the young clerk at the booth looked him over and pushed his money back, the night shifted. What began as a trip down memory lane spiraled into something else entirely, a quiet battle for dignity, history, and truth. Because Otis wasn't just any patron. And the theater had no idea who they just turned away. Real quick, do you usually watch stories like this with a snack, while cleaning, or just laying back? Let me know how you watch. This one's unexpectedly powerful, and you want to stay for every second. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any like it. Otis Langston adjusted his flat cap in the rearview mirror. At 73, he still took pride in his appearance, especially for special occasions. Tonight was certainly special. The Grand Majestic Theatre was showing Fences by August Wilson, Otis's favorite playwright. He smoothed the creases in his cardigan and checked his wallet. The crisp $50 bill waited inside, more than enough for a ticket and maybe a program. Otis smiled at his reflection. His father had taught him, always dress your best when you go downtown. Give them no excuse. The Grand Majestic stood like a palace against the evening sky. Its marquee lights burned bright against the darkening blue. Otis had loved this theater since he was a boy, when he peeked through the stage door to watch rehearsals. Later, he'd worked backstage during college, before life took him in different directions. The theater had changed hands several times over the decades, but its grandeur remained. White columns framed the entrance. Gold trim sparkled around vintage posters. A line of well-dressed patrons waited at the ticket booth. Otis joined the queue, leaning slightly on his cane. His knee bothered him these days, but he'd rather stand than miss this show. He watched as the young clerk in the booth greeted each customer with a smile. Good seats still available, the clerk announced to a young couple ahead of Otis. The line moved quickly. Otis rehearsed his request in his mind. Second level, center if possible. Not too close to the stage, his neck couldn't handle looking up for 3 hours. As he approached the window, Otis noticed the clerk's smile fade. The young man, his name tag read Blake, suddenly seemed busy with something under the counter. "Good evening," Otis said, placing his 50 on the small metal tray. "One ticket for tonight's performance, please." Blake barely looked up. His face went blank, as if a curtain had dropped. "We're sold out," he said flatly. Otis blinked in surprise. "Sold out? But you just told that couple." "I said we're sold out," Blake repeated, louder this time. He pushed the 50 back without touching it. Behind Otis, a white woman in a blouse and pearls approached the second window. Blake's colleague greeted her warmly. "One for tonight?" "Certainly. That'll be $45. Otis felt heat rising in his chest. He'd seen this before, too many times to count. The rules changed when it was his turn. He picked up his money slowly, dignity intact but spirit bruised. "I see," was all he said. Blake's eyes darted away from Otis, focusing instead on the people behind him. The message was clear: move along. But Otis didn't move. 60 years ago, he might have shuffled away, head down. Not today. "Young man," Otis said, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside. "I can see tickets being sold right next to me. Why am I being told different?" Blake sighed dramatically. "Look, it's complicated. We have reserved sections, special memberships." "I've been coming to this theater since before you were born," Otis replied. "I know how the ticketing works." A few people in line began to notice the exchange. A woman 2 spots back frowned, looking between Otis and Blake with growing concern. "Sir, please move aside. You're holding up the line." Blake's voice carried a warning. Otis reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'd like to speak with a manager, please." Blake rolled his eyes. "Manager's busy." "Look, we just don't have what you want." The woman who had been watching stepped forward. "Excuse me, but I just heard you tell the couple ahead that good seats were available. What changed in 5 minutes?" Blake's face flushed red. "Ma'am, please wait your turn." She crossed her arms. "I'll wait after this gentleman gets his ticket." Blake's coworker at the next window looked uncomfortable. She leaned over and whispered something. Blake shook his head firmly. Otis stood perfectly still, his hand resting on his cane. He faced down worse than this young man with his practiced indifference. Far worse. "I'll wait for the manager," Otis said simply. A security guard approached, drawn by the minor commotion. "Everything okay here?" Blake pointed at Otis. "This man won't move along after I explained we're sold out." The security guard, a middle-aged black man, looked at Otis with a flicker of recognition. "Mr. Langston, is that you?" Blake's expression changed instantly. "You know him." "Know him?" The guard chuckled. "Sir, do you know who this is?" Before he could continue, a woman in a tailored suit hurried from inside the lobby. "What's happening here?" "We have a show starting in 30 minutes. The name badge on her blazer read, "Sarah Miller, Manager." Otis turned to her with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout. "Good evening, Ms. Miller. It seems there's some confusion about whether tickets are available tonight." Sarah looked between Blake and Otis, clearly trying to assess the situation quickly. "This gentleman insists on a ticket when we're at capacity," Blake said before Sarah could speak. "That's interesting," the woman from the line interjected, "since your colleague just sold a ticket right next to you." Sarah's professional smile faltered. She glanced at the other booth where transactions continued smoothly. "Let me see what we can do," she said, clearly sensing trouble. Sarah led Otis to a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the growing line. The marble floor echoed with each tap of his cane. "I apologize for any confusion, sir," she began, her voice pitched low. "Perhaps there was a miscommunication about available seating." Otis looked her directly in the eyes. "Ms. Miller, we both know what happened out there." "It wasn't a miscommunication." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sure Blake didn't intend." "Intentions don't matter much when the result is the same," Otis cut in gently. "I've been coming to the Grand Majestic since 1965. I've seen this before." Her eyes widened slightly. "You've been coming here that long?" "Longer, actually." Otis's mind flashed back to his younger days. "I worked backstage during college. Operated the lights for Raisin in the Sun in '68. Sarah seemed genuinely surprised. "I had no idea. Look, why don't I find you a ticket myself? We can sort this out." Otis shook his head. "This isn't about just me getting a seat anymore. It's about making sure the next person who looks like me doesn't face the same treatment." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. Sarah watched nervously as he waited for an answer. "Eleanor." "It's Otis." "Yes, at the theater now. Having that problem we discussed." "Yes." 20 minutes? Perfect." He ended the call and pocketed his phone. "Ms. Miller, I'm going to step outside for some fresh air. When I return, we'll need to have a more substantial conversation." "Sir, if you leave, I can't guarantee." "I'm not asking for guarantees," Otis replied. "I'm telling you what's going to happen next." As he walked toward the doors, he passed Blake still working the booth, now avoiding eye contact. The security guard gave Otis a respectful nod, which Otis returned with a small smile. Outside, the evening air felt cool against his face. Otis sat on a bench near the entrance, watching patrons stream inside. He felt a familiar weight in his chest, not just anger, but the exhaustion of fighting the same battles decade after decade. In his mind, he could see the theater as it was in the '60s, when he'd slip in through the stage door. Back then, black patrons were relegated to the balcony. He remembered the day the policy officially ended, and how the unofficial segregation continued through subtle means. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "On my way." Bringing the documents, Otis nodded to himself. He hadn't wanted to use them. Had hoped the world had changed enough. But some lessons needed to be taught more than once. 20 minutes later, a town car pulled up to the curb. Eleanor Washington stepped out, elegant in a deep purple suit, her silver hair framing a face that commanded respect. She carried a leather portfolio under her arm. "Otis," she greeted him with a warm hug. "Ready to make some history?" "Again." "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, standing up straighter. Together, they walked back toward the lobby doors. The lobby buzzed with pre-show excitement. Patrons clutched programs and chatted about the production. No one seemed to notice Otis and Eleanor enter. No one except Sarah Miller, whose face fell when she spotted them. "Ms. Miller," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying across the marble floor. "I believe we need to discuss an urgent matter." Sarah hurried over, anxiety evident in her quick steps. "Ms. Washington, I didn't expect to see you tonight." "Clearly not," Eleanor replied coolly. "I understand my friend Mr. Langston encountered some difficulties purchasing a ticket." Sarah's eyes darted between them. "There was a misunderstanding that we're working to resolve." "No misunderstanding," Otis said firmly. "Your ticket clerk refused to sell to me while continuing to serve white patrons." A few nearby theatergoers slowed their conversations, ears perking up at the exchange. Eleanor opened her portfolio. "Sarah, I've been on the theater's community advisory board for 5 years. In that time, we've received 7 complaints about discriminatory treatment at the ticket booth, all dismissed as misunderstandings." Sarah's professional veneer cracked slightly. "Ms. Washington, perhaps we could discuss this in my office?" "No," Otis said quietly. "This happened publicly. We'll address it publicly." The security guard who had recognized Otis earlier approached. "Everything okay here?" "Marcus," Eleanor nodded to him. "Would you please locate Mr. Grant? Tell him Eleanor Washington and Otis Langston need to speak with him immediately." "Mr. Grant is in a pre-show meeting with the director," Sarah protested. "Interrupt it," Eleanor said. Her tone left no room for argument. Marcus nodded and headed toward the administrative offices. While they waited, Otis noticed Blake watching nervously from the ticket booth. The young man's arrogance had melted into something closer to fear. "Ms. Miller," Otis said, "perhaps you should know exactly who you're dealing with." Eleanor handed Sarah a yellowed newspaper clipping from the portfolio. It showed a much younger Otis standing with a group outside the very same theater, holding protest signs. 1968, Otis explained. "When the theater finally desegregated after community pressure. I was part of that pressure." Sarah studied the photo, recognition dawning on her face. "That's not all," Eleanor continued, pulling out more documents. "Show her Otis." Before he could, a tall man in an expensive suit burst through a side door. Walter Grant, the theater's owner, looked harried and annoyed. "Eleanor, what is so urgent it couldn't wait until tomorrow?" His gaze shifted to Otis, showing no recognition. Eleanor's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Walter, your establishment just discriminated against one of the most important figures in this theater's history. And we're about to discuss why that's going to cost you significantly more than a ticket price." Walter's annoyed expression faltered as Marcus whispered something in his ear. He looked at Otis with new, uncertain eyes. "Mr. Langston," he said slowly, "I don't believe we've met." "No," Otis replied, "but I knew your father well, and he knew exactly who I am." The 5 of them, Otis, Eleanor, Walter, Sarah, and Marcus, stood in a tense circle as the last patrons filtered into the theater for the evening show. "My father?" Walter asked, genuine confusion crossing his face. "How did you know him?" Otis fixed his gaze on Walter. "Your father, Richard Grant, bought this theater in 1975 when it was about to be demolished for a parking garage." "Yes, that's common knowledge," Walter replied impatiently. "What isn't common knowledge," Eleanor interjected, "is where the money came from." She laid a document on a nearby counter. It was a faded partnership agreement, dated 1975. "Your father didn't have enough capital to purchase the Grand Majestic outright," Otis explained. "He needed investors." Walter scanned the document, his face paling. "This shows a silent partnership with OL Holdings." He looked up sharply. "Otis Langston. I worked for the Postal Service for 30 years, Otis said. Saved everything I could. By 1975, I had enough to invest in something meaningful. This theater was where I first fell in love with the arts, even when I had to enter through the back door." Sarah's jaw dropped. "You're an owner. But why haven't you?" "The arrangement was that Richard would manage day-to-day operations," Eleanor explained. "Otis would remain a silent partner with a 40% stake." We have all the documentation. Walter shook his head. If this is true, why come forward now? After all these years, Otis's eyes flashed with a fire that belied his age. Because nothing has changed. I couldn't buy a ticket to a show in a theater I partially own because that young man decided my money wasn't good enough. More patrons had noticed the confrontation. A small crowd gathered at a respectful distance, sensing something significant unfolding. This is absurd, Walter sputtered. One employee's action doesn't represent. It absolutely does, Eleanor cut in. We have documented at least 7 similar incidents in the past 5 years. All dismissed, all ignored. Marcus stepped forward. Sir, if I may, what Mr. Langston is saying is true. I've worked security here for 12 years. I've seen it happen. Walter looked stricken. Why didn't you report it? To who? Marcus asked simply. Ms. Miller? You? The complaints disappeared like smoke. Sarah stared at her shoes, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Blake, watching from the ticket booth, had grown increasingly pale. He picked up a phone, likely calling for reinforcements. Here's what happens next, Otis said, his voice gaining strength. I'm exercising my right as an owner to inspect the books. I want to see where the profits have gone for 45 years. I want to know why my name isn't on a single program or donor wall despite my investment. Walter's professional demeanor crumbled completely. My father never told me. I inherited the theater when he died. I had no idea. That's the problem, Eleanor said. Black contributions are erased. Black ownership is hidden. Black patrons are turned away. And everyone claims ignorance. The lobby fell silent as the implications sank in. The show inside had already begun, but a bigger drama was unfolding in the lobby. Walter straightened his tie, clearly trying to regain control. Mr. Langston, I propose we take this discussion to my office where we can. No, Otis said firmly. First, I want to address your staff and the remaining patrons. Tonight's show will not continue until I've had my say. Walter's face flushed red. You can't just stop a performance that's already underway. Actually, Eleanor said, sliding another document from her portfolio. According to Section 8 of the partnership agreement, any managing partner can halt operations for safety or ethical concerns. She smiled thinly. Discrimination certainly qualifies. Otis turned to Marcus. Would you please inform the stage manager to pause the performance? Tell them Mr. Langston, co-owner of the Grand Majestic, needs to address the audience. Marcus hesitated, looking to Walter for confirmation. Do it, Walter said, resigned. But Mr. Langston, I hope you understand the disruption this will cause. I've lived with disruption my entire life, Otis replied calmly. It's time you experience some. Word spread quickly through the theater. Staff members whispered to each other. Patrons who had been lingering in the lobby pulled out phones, sensing something newsworthy unfolding. Blake emerged from the ticket booth, approaching Sarah with panic in his eyes. What's happening? Sarah pulled him aside, speaking in urgent whispers. Blake's face cycled through disbelief, fear, and finally, defensive anger. He broke away from Sarah, approaching Otis directly. Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I never meant. Stop, Otis raised his hand. I'm not interested in your excuses. Your actions spoke clearly enough. Inside the theater, the house lights came up. Confused murmurs rippled through the audience as the actors paused mid-scene. Walter addressed Otis and Eleanor. Before we go in there, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. I had no knowledge of your ownership stake. My father never revealed this to me. Whether you knew or not doesn't change what happened tonight, Eleanor replied. Or the pattern of similar incidents. The stage manager appeared in the lobby, clearly flustered. Mr. Grant, what's going on? We've stopped the show as requested. Walter gestured to Otis. This is Mr. Langston. He's a co-owner of the theater. He needs to address the audience. The stage manager's eyebrows shot up. Co-owner? But I've worked here for 7 years and never. Exactly the problem, Otis said quietly. Together, they walked toward the auditorium. Blake tried to slip away, but Eleanor caught his arm. Oh no, young man. You're coming too. You need to hear this more than anyone. Inside, the grand auditorium glowed with soft light. Nearly 800 people sat in confused silence. The actors stood frozen on stage, uncertain what is happening. Otis walked slowly down the center aisle, leaning on his cane. Every eye followed his progress. Some patrons recognized him from the lobby incident and began whispering to their neighbors. The theater had never felt so silent, so attentive. Otis reached the front row and turned to face the audience. Walter reluctantly handed him a microphone. Otis gazed out at the sea of faces. This moment was 60 years in the making. In the back of his mind, he could still hear his father's voice. Always dress your best when you go downtown. Give them no excuse. He took a deep breath and brought the microphone to his lips. Good evening, Otis began, his voice strong despite his years. My name is Otis Langston. I apologize for interrupting your evening, but some things are more important than a single performance. He surveyed the crowd, a mix of confused, curious, and impatient faces. 47 years ago, I helped save this theater. When the previous owners faced bankruptcy, I invested my life savings to preserve this cultural landmark. I became a 40% owner of the Grand Majestic Theatre. Murmurs rippled through the audience. On stage, the actors exchanged startled glances. Yet tonight, I was refused a ticket by that young man. Otis pointed to Blake, who shrank under the sudden attention. He told me the show was sold out while selling tickets to white patrons right next to me. The murmurs grew louder. Several audience members stood to get a better look at Blake. This isn't about one bad employee, Otis continued. It's about a pattern. About how black contributions are erased from history. About how spaces we help build still don't welcome us. Eleanor stepped forward, adding her voice. The documentation of Mr. Langston's ownership has been verified. For decades, his investment helped keep this theater running, while his name was deliberately kept hidden. Walter stepped up reluctantly. It appears my late father concealed Mr. Langston's ownership role, even from me. This is inexcusable. A woman in the third row stood up. Sir, are you saying you own this theater, but couldn't buy a ticket to your own show? That's exactly what I'm saying, Otis replied. The audience erupted in outrage. Phones captured the moment from every angle. Someone shouted, "Shame," directed at Blake. Otis raised his hand for quiet. I don't want your anger. I want change. Real change. He turned to Walter. Starting tonight, the Grand Majestic will acknowledge its full history. My name will appear alongside your father's in the lobby. And more importantly, a new anti-discrimination policy will be implemented with actual consequences. Walter nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment, and likely the legal and public relations disaster looming if he refused. As for tonight's performance, Otis continued, I'm exercising my right as an owner to cancel it. Gasps and protests arose from the audience. Instead, Otis said, silencing them, I invite you all to the reception hall, where I'll share the true history of this theater, including the black artists, workers, and patrons who made it great, despite being relegated to the shadows. He looked directly at Blake. Young man, you'll be there too. It's time you learned whose shoulders you stand on. The audience rose in a standing ovation, not for the show they'd come to see, but for the unexpected truth laid bare before them. As Otis turned to leave the stage, Walter stopped him. Mr. Langston, what happens now? With the theater, Otis looked him in the eye. That depends on what you do next, Walter. Sometimes the hardest part isn't acknowledging the past. It's changing the future. The audience continued applauding as Otis made his way up the aisle, his cane tapping rhythmically against the carpet. For the first time in decades, he walked through his theater not as a visitor seeking permission to enter, but as an owner claiming his rightful place. The reception hall buzzed with energy as patrons filed in. Theater staff scrambled to arrange chairs and bring refreshments. What had begun as an August Wilson play had transformed into something far more compelling, truth unfolding in real time. Otis sat in a chair at the front, Eleanor beside him, as Walter nervously introduced him to the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Mr. Otis Langston, whose contribution to this theater has gone unrecognized for far too long. Applause erupted as Otis stood. He gestured for Blake to come forward. The young man approached reluctantly, eyes downcast. "Stand here beside me," Otis instructed. "I want you to hear this most of all." For the next hour, Otis shared the hidden history of the Grand Majestic. He described working backstage in the 1960s when black patrons could only sit in the balcony. He recalled the protest that finally ended official segregation and the subtle discrimination that continued afterward. In 1975, when the theater faced demolition, Richard Grant approached me, Otis explained. He needed capital. I had savings and loved this place despite how it had treated people who looked like me. He pulled out a faded photograph, Richard Grant and a young Otis shaking hands in front of the theater. We signed a partnership agreement. Richard would manage operations. I would be a silent investor with 40% ownership. Walter stepped forward. A partnership my father never disclosed to me or anyone else. "Why did you stay silent all these years?" someone called out. Otis smiled sadly. "I believed the theater's survival was more important than my recognition. I thought time would naturally bend toward justice." He glanced at Blake. "I was wrong." Blake's face had transformed during Otis's story. The defensive anger had melted into what looked like genuine shame. "Sir," Blake said, his voice barely audible, "I didn't know." "Exactly," Otis replied. "You didn't know because someone decided my contribution should remain invisible. Just like tonight, you decided I should remain invisible." A woman rose from her seat. "Mr. Langston, what do you want from the theater now?" Otis leaned forward, energy sparking in his eyes. "I want my name on the ownership documents where it belongs. I want a scholarship program for young black artists. I want staff training on the theater's full history." He paused. "And I want my seat, front row center, for every opening night from now on." The crowd applauded again. Social media was already ablaze with the story. Local news crews had arrived, setting up cameras in the back. Walter stepped to the microphone. "On behalf of the Grand Majestic, I want to publicly apologize to Mr. Langston. Starting tomorrow, all his requests will be implemented." He turned to Blake. "As for tonight's incident, there must be consequences." Blake swallowed hard. "I understand if you need to fire me." Otis raised his hand. "If I may." He addressed Blake directly. "Firing you would be easy, but it wouldn't teach you anything. Instead, I want you to lead our new community outreach program. Your job will be bringing theater to neighborhoods that have been excluded." Blake looked stunned. "Sir, I don't know if I'm qualified." "You weren't qualified to judge me at the ticket booth either," Otis replied. "But you'll learn. We all will." The crowd rose in a final standing ovation as Otis stood, dignity intact and justice served. The theater that had once refused him entry would now carry his name. 3 months later, Otis stood in the lobby of the Grand Majestic, admiring the new bronze plaque beside the entrance. The Grand Majestic Theatre, preserved in 1975 through the partnership of Richard Grant and Otis Langston, where all stories deserve to be told and all people deserve to hear them. The theater had been transformed. Photos of black performers who had graced its stage lined the walls. A new exhibit chronicled the fight against segregation in the arts. And ticket booth policies had been completely overhauled, with diversity training for all staff. Walter approached, extending his hand. Opening night. "Your seat is ready, Mr. Langston." Their relationship had evolved from confrontation to cautious cooperation. Walter had proven genuinely committed to change once he understood the truth. "How's our outreach program coming along?" Otis asked. Walter smiled. "Actually, Blake has something to show you." He led Otis to a side room where Blake stood with a group of teenagers, all holding scripts. "Mr. Langston," Blake greeted him, a new humility in his voice. "These students are from Central High School. They're our first youth theater company." The teens looked at Otis with reverence, clearly aware of his story. One girl stepped forward. "Mr. Langston, we're performing scenes about the theater's history, including your story. Would you watch our rehearsal sometime?" Otis felt his eyes growing moist. "I'd be honored." Blake handed Otis a program. "We've included the full history this time. No more erasure." As they walked toward the auditorium, Eleanor joined them, resplendent in evening wear. Quite a change from the last time we were here, she remarked. Otis nodded. Change comes slowly, then all at once. Inside, the theater hummed with pre-show excitement. As Otis made his way to his seat, front row, center, patrons recognized him, offering respectful nods or words of appreciation. He settled into his seat, running his hand over the small plaque on the armrest, reserved for Otis Langston Conner. The house lights dimmed. The curtain rose. And for the first time in his long life, Otis Langston watched a performance in the theater he helped save, not as an outsider seeking acceptance, but as a rightful owner finally claiming his place. Behind him, a young black family was being escorted to their seats by none other than Blake himself, showing them the same deference and respect once reserved for others. Otis smiled to himself. Some lessons were harder than others. But in the end, the story had changed, not just for him, but for everyone who would walk through those doors in the years to come. As the actors took the stage, Otis thought of his father's words, "Always dress your best when you go downtown. Give them no excuse." He hadn't just given them no excuse. He had given them a new standard. That brings us to the end of this powerful journey. Otis didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet strength spoke louder than any shout ever could. What he carried wasn't just an old document. It was decades of being overlooked, erased, and pushed aside. And still, he chose to rebuild, not destroy. That's what made it unforgettable. The real change doesn't come from anger. It comes from the courage to stand still and speak truth when the world tries to move on. Should Otis have shut the whole show down, or was that too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think. And hey, if you're still here, you clearly love good storytelling. Subscribe now. You won't find stories like this anywhere else. Click and check out another one next.